And hi, guys, how are you? Time for another story. This is an interesting one. Um, on this particular story, it was May 4th, 2001 at 9:30 p.m. And a man by the name of Sean Stanek heard a crazy knock at his door, screaming and knocking. He didn't know what was going on. He opens up the door, and standing there was Robert Blake. Now, who is Robert Blake? Who does not know Robert Blake? If you're old enough, of you're a person of a certain age, Robert Blake used to be one of the Little Rascals. Now, you may not have been old enough to know about Little Rascals when they were originally created, but they always had them on TV on Saturdays. I watched them myself. He also, one of his more outstanding movies was In Cold Blood. Um, he also was Beretta. Everybody knows Beretta. That was my show every week with the cockatoo on his shoulder, and he played this New York gritty, grimy detective that was tough talking and all of that. And actually, Robert made like 70 movies before he even got famous. I mean, he was that busy in Hollywood from being a child star all the way up. Well, on this particular night, May 4th, 2001, at 9:30 p.m., Robert Blake, like I said, was knocking at the door of a gentleman by the name of Sean Stanek. I have to get some drinks from Bubba. Um, Blake was hysterical. Okay, he was screaming. He had said to the gentleman that somebody mugged us and beat my wife and all of that. And this guy, you can imagine, he was just amazed, standing at his door, wondering what in the heck is going on. And Robert is getting ready to leave, and he's saying, "Well, Robert, where are you going? Where's your wife?" And he tells the guy to go down by my car, which was down the street from him, and check on her, see if she's okay. And he's like, "Well, where are you going?" "Well, I'm going back to the restaurant." See, they had eaten at this Italian restaurant called Vitello's. They had dinner that night, and he's saying he was going to go back to the restaurant and see if there was a doctor or a nurse that could help him. So let me pause right there. Here comes the foolishness. I'm going to not use the telephone at the man's house, right? In 2001. I probably even had a cell phone. I can't verify if he had a cell phone because he didn't use it. But I'm going to your house. I'm knocking on your door, and I'm not using your phone to call 911. I'm not asking you to call 911. I'm going back in the restaurant to find a doctor or a nurse. Seriously? Okay, so that is the story that is being told by this Sean. This is true. I believe Sean. It's not that I don't, but I'm just saying on Robert's part, that seems peculiar to me. So anyway, Sean goes to the car slowly, trying to see what's going on. He doesn't know if there's somebody still lingering or what. Now the car is parked behind a jumbled garbage dumpsters. Have you ever seen those dumpsters when people are clearing out their house or their basement or whatever, and they get those big, steel dumpsters dropped off? Well, there was one of those, and the car was parked behind that, and it was super dark, he said, and there was one light that was lit kind of behind the car. So you really couldn't even see the car. He went to the car, and in there he saw Bonnie Bakley. Now, who is Bonnie Bakley? She was a 45-year-old woman who ended up marrying Robert Blake and having his child. But we'll get into that. He goes to the car, and she is barely alive. She's gasping for breath. She's gurgling. It's all just tragic. Blood everywhere. He notices that she has a gunshot wound right here on her cheek, doesn't know what's going on. So then Robert, comes back to the car and is asking him what's going on. Robert doesn't go in the car. Robert doesn't even touch his wife. This is your wife, okay? Doesn't do any of that. He's asking what's going on. Okay. So Sean ends up calling 911. Tells them, we've had a shooting out here. Do you know Robert Blake? He was an actor, and it's his wife. Um, Ambulance comes, and they come to the car. Um, they're asking Robert. He seemingly is vague and he doesn't know what's going on. But they find that this woman is in the car and she's got one gunshot wound to her head, which is that, and one in her chest. And she's has expired. She's died at this point. So they ask Robert, well, what happened? Now he's claiming that they went to this Fratello's restaurant and they had dinner. That they went back to the car, their car, Robert's car, which was a block and a half away from the restaurant. Why would you park a block and a half away? As it turns out, the restaurant wasn't even crowded that night, and there was plenty of parking in the well lit parking lot. But he doesn't park there. So he tells him that he realizes, Robert tells them, the police, he realizes he's forgotten his gun in the restaurant and that he's going to go back to the restaurant and get this gun. And he tells Bonnie, I'll be right back. He says he goes into the restaurant, gets the gun and everything else, except when they question the maitre d' as well as waiters and waitresses in the restaurant, they never saw him come back in the restaurant. They knew he was there. He was a regular there. He was no stranger. He didn't just pop up as a surprise. The restaurant was in his own neighborhood. That's even how Sean, who was the first person at the scene, knew of Robert because Robert lived in the neighborhood. So he says that he got back to the car. This is his story. Once he retrieved the gun and he found her in this condition. So two people went to the restaurant and only one person left. That's interesting. So let's look at Bonnie Bakley. Now, Bonnie wasn't this perfect person, not at all. That doesn't mean that she deserved to be killed, but she was living in Arkansas, but she was born in New Jersey. Um, you would consider her a hustler. She was one of these romance, love them and leave them types of ladies. She would find these older gentlemen in ads or on the internet. She would get to know them. If they were very wealthy, she would marry them. She was able to con them out of their money or to get them to sign her on as a sole beneficiary on their insurance. In a lot of her ID, she had a lot of old tapes where she had some very harsh conversations recorded from Christian Brando, which we'll talk about him in a moment, as well as Robert Blake. She also had many fake IDs and fake names on credit cards. She just was really a whole mess. And in fact, and God bless her, rest in peace. Her sister even had talked to the investigators about that she was afraid that Robert was going to hurt her or kill her because of her way of getting with men and marrying them, including Robert. Now, she was not what we'd call a typical beautiful woman, but she had a sexy, attractive, sensual uh, allure that men really love. She was a very sensual woman, and this was a big draw for many men. Um, she had met Robert Blake out and about. Prior to that, she was messing with some other men. Once she met him, she was just smitten by him automatically. In fact, so much so that on the first night he was going to take her to her home, they ended up getting intimate sensually inside of Robert's car, getting unclothed and everything else. Um, she was also dealing with Christian Brando, and that was Marlon Brando's son. Now, at this point, Christian had already killed his sister's boyfriend. And if you remember with Brando, the daughter, I believe she killed herself. She was messing with some guy that was abusive and harsh and into drugs and everything, and got into it with Christian, and Christian ended up killing him. And so he had spent some time in prison. And Christian was this just really there for the fun of it, not trying to marry Bonnie simply because he didn't have his own money or his own fame. His fame was through his father. And Bonnie was a very smart and cunning person, so much so that when she first met Robert Blake, she went home and did a search on him and saw he was worth like $8 million. And so she knew that she was going to go towards Robert versus Christian. Now, she still was messing around with Christian. They still were intimate as well as with Robert. So Bonnie ends up getting pregnant. And at this point, she doesn't know which one of these people is the father. She's going back and forth telling Christian he's the father, and then telling uh, Robert that he's the father, but honestly, not really knowing who the father was. And Robert had had enough of this back and forth, and he decided to get, a DNA test to see if he was the father of the little girl that was born. And it turned out that he was the father. And Christian decided, if you're not going to be with me and we're not going to raise this child together, then I'm done. So he took himself out of it. It was a bad breakup, but it didn't arise to murder. In fact, they questioned Christian regarding the murder, and many people spoke on the fact that he wasn't even there. He was in the state of Washington. He had alibi. He wasn't there the night that she lost her life. So, as it turned out, Bonnie took the baby and went back to Arkansas. Bonnie was on probation for some of her crimes that she had done, and she was, supposed to stay in Arkansas. But really, Robert wanted that baby. He wanted to raise this little child, not wanting Bonnie, but wanting the relationship. So he ended up getting into contact with her multiple times and then asked her, "Why don't you come and live with me? And you can live in the guest house, and I'll live in the main house, and we can raise the baby together." Well, they did, but Bonnie shenanigans continued, and her and Robert, the relationship part had really fizzled out as fast as it had started. And so they had become more adversaries. And Bonnie was using this child as a tool to manipulate Robert to get the things she wanted or do what she wanted. And she always threatened to him that she was going to take this child and go back to Arkansas and get sole custody of her child. Now, at this point, Robert was at his wits' end. Okay. He just couldn't live with someone that was constantly threatening him and still trying to seek side relationships to help enrich themselves. Because these men would send her money upon money upon money um, for pictures that she took or things that she said or what have you. It ended up where, and this is one of the stuntmen that Robert had talked to, and there was actually three or four, but each time he had talked to the stuntman, and this one in particular went to the police with it and said that Robert had come to him and told him that for $10,000, I need you to take care of this problem, the problem being Bonnie. He had even suggested ways of doing it. He said that they could go to a restaurant and I'll act like I'm going back into the restaurant and then you kill her and nobody will ever know. Well, ended up that the stuntmen, the three or four stuntmen, they decided, no, I don't want to do that. They weren't willing to put their own life on the line for him. They didn't have that type of a close relationship with them. These are people that he had worked with back during Beretta's days. Oh, that's a motorcycle going past my house. But those were people that he was dealing with during the Beretta days. Um, Ultimately, the police did find the gun that was used in the crime. They found it in a garbage dumpster. Um, the serial number was so old that it had never even been registered to anything. On top of that, the gun was covered with motor oil because, as it comes to find out, that if you cover the gun in motor oil, it would help to disintegrate the fingerprints. And he wanted to make sure there were no fingerprints. Now the police, they absolutely suspect that Robert is the shooter, but they're trying to get their evidence together. And it wasn't until April 18th, 2002, 11 months later, where they had enough evidence and they arrested him. They said the motive was contempt for his wife, as well as him feeling trapped in this marriage. And I guess in essence he was, but that's what happened. Now, 2.5 more years pass, and they finally go to trial. That was December 20th, 2004. During that 2.5 years, they had kept Robert in the house under house arrest with the ankle bracelet and the whole thing. Um, he was being charged with 1 count of murder and 2 counts of solicitation of murder. And if found guilty, he could get life. Now, the problem was that when he finally did make his court appearance, he did not come in as Beretta. He did not come as the little boy in the Little Rascals. No, he came in as he was very small, I shouldn't say, is. He came in as a little old man, all white hair, very thin, very drawn, tired looking. So much so that he garnered the sympathy of the jury. They just couldn't see him plotting this and planning this, or even him having the gun. Um, so they ended up having the trial. The defense said that, um, first of all, they said the evidence was flimsy. They said that the stuntmen were unreliable, that they had had drug abuse issues, they had been alcoholics, they were lying, they wanted to get into, fame again, get into the limelight through this way. They were going to coattail off of each other and make this big story and get rich. Um, and then that second gun, the one that they found, that they actually did ballistic tests on it. They found that it was the murder weapon, but they couldn't connect it to Robert because once again, the motor oil took off the fingerprints, and the gun was so old that they couldn't connect it to a with the serial number to anything. So the defense said, well, you can't even connect the gun to Robert, so you don't even have any evidence that he did that. Um, so once it went to the jury after the trial, they spent 9 days deliberating on his guilt or innocence. And ultimately, they found Robert not guilty. Although he has never worked again in Hollywood because that's one of those worst kept secrets. They knew that he did that. And finally, Bonnie's family actually took him to court in a civil case, charging him with the murder of his sister. And guess what? They won the case civilly, just like in the OJ trial. They won that case. So much so they bankrupted um, Robert Blake, completely. So now I thought I would look at his birthday and his birth numbers as well as Bonnie's. And I'm going to tell you and show you this is why you know he did it. He did this crime, allegedly. I'm going to say allegedly for the YouTube people. But Robert was born on September 18th, 1933, in Nutley, New Jersey. So if we look at 2002, when the crime was committed, he was in a number 3 year. And so if it's well dignified, he's charming, he's bubbly, he's socializing, he's all that. But he was not even really that person. So he was never well dignified. He was always on the negative side. And that would make him always complaining, always crying, always feeling a victim of something. That is number 3, is the victim number. His life path is a number 7, which is very intelligent, very analytical, thinking things through step by step. That is why he was able to tell these stuntmen, this is the way to do it. Do these steps. And this is the why he followed the same steps he told them to do, is what he did. Got her to the restaurant. They ate, took her to the car, a block and a half away from an empty parking lot. Come on now. And then said he had to go back in the restaurant. But then she ends up dead. And then the gun is found in the garbage dumpster. Everything exactly that he said to the stuntman to tell is exactly what happened. His rising is in Scorpio right away. You know that he's quiet. He likes a lot of me time. And here you've got a baby and a woman. And the baby he didn't mind, but it was the woman, He was very secretive. He had super deep emotions, very stubborn. That is why he was staying in this battle with her for this child. That's why he wanted the DNA. He was convinced that this was his child. He was very resourceful. So that tells me he could come up with plans. And he had a lot of anger in him. Um, his sun in Virgo tells me that he was very cautious. He was naturally like a natural detective of things. And he was also very super critical on himself, but most especially on other people, because that's how he was raised. If you look into his history, you'll see his parents were extremely harsh on him to the amount of, I would say, child abuse. But that made him super nitpicky with Bonnie. Okay. If he didn't like you, you were just at the mercy of his tongue and his criticism. He was very serious minded, like I said, but very hard on himself. His Libra in Mercury. So that tells me that is why he talked to stuntmen. He was going back and forth. Who should do it? Should I do it? Should it be done? Rather than just having this straight plan, like if he had a son in Scorpio, he was wavering back and forth. He wanted it done, but how and who was where he was wavering. Now, here's the tough part for him. He had a Mars in Scorpio. He has that. So that makes him super intense. That fire and water combination is not a good match. You've got Mars that is a warrior planet. It's ready to fight. And then you've got Scorpio, which part Mars too, hot on fire. It's so much so that once when you have this particular placement, your Scorpios and your Mars, if you come up with a plan, a scheme, or whatever, you decide that you're going to do that, you're going to follow it all the way through, all the way. No one's going to be able to stop you. And he was a very angry person. So much so with this placement, he was quick to anger and to an extreme point, to a real blow up point to where that anger would just linger with him. He would seek revenge. And with that Scorpio rising, that Scorpio Mars, he would get revenge, period, but you wouldn't see it coming. Um, and how could he keep living or how could he could deny it? That Saturn is that Aquarius is in Saturn. So that says that he is detached emotionally. His North Node, which says the direction you should be living as an Aquarius, groups, friends, that type of warmth is in the South Node, and his South Node is in Leo. So he should be achieving his North Node in Aquarius, but he's living in his South Node in Leo, and that Leo roared. All this fixed energy in him says, I was going to do this, period. That's what's happening. Whereas if you look at Bonnie Bakley, she was June 7th, 1956. And June 7th is definitely a Gemini. With that 7 right in the middle of her birthday during the time that she would have been killed, meant that she thought she could outsmart everybody. And she was. She could, except you always going to meet your match. You're going to always, no matter how cunning and smart and slick you are, she met her match. She had a Virgo rising and a sun in Gemini and a moon in Taurus. So she was sensual. She was smart. She even has Mercury in Gemini. That's the genius spot. She could come up with these schemes and these plans, but she got so caught up in the power of it and so mentally, so not mentally lazy, but emotionally lazy with that Taurus in there where wanting the finer things of life and the finer foods and the finer clothes, but not necessarily having to put the work in. That Gemini there says that she would have did anything for a buck, and she did. She's got a Mars in Pisces, and that's not good because for a Mars in Pisces, people tend to be deceptive and they tend to do things behind your back. And that's what she was doing all along. And that's what she did to Robert. And when Robert finally woke up and saw what was happening, he snapped, period. So much so, he's already told people what he's done. Did he do this crime? Yes, he did. You don't need to park a block and a half away from the restaurant in the darkest possible sleep street behind a dumpster where you can't be spotted if you're going to do something devious or dirty. You don't need that if you didn't do it. You don't need to bring a gun to a restaurant. Now, he's saying that he did it because she had scammed so many people. He was always trying to protect her and he knew this was going to happen. She wasn't that worried because she left from Arkansas and came up to Hollywood. So she wasn't that worried. And I don't think that you were either. Period. The fact that he says he went back into the restaurant to get the gun. Number one, who in the hell goes to the restaurant, takes a firearm that's loaded, and lays it up on the dinner table? Come on now. Stop. And if you were a regular at this restaurant and you did happen to have your gun and brought it back, they would have happily got in touch with you. See, because he had a set table in there. He had one table he went to all the time. So it wasn't like he was sitting all over the restaurant. So they knew if the gun was there, oh my goodness, let's go out and get him, or let's call him and let him know. Not to mention the fact, since you're already in your car with your wife and you've realized, oh my goodness, I left the gun there. Why wouldn't you just drive up to the restaurant instead of parking and, leaving the car parked where it was and walk another block and a half? Drive up to the front of the restaurant, run in the door, tell the maitre d', they would have handed it to you. Yeah. Okay. Anyways, um, did Robert Blakely kill his wife? 100% he did. He had going for him nothing necessarily that was in his favor in his chart. Um, Jupiter in Libra is nice. That's a nice place, but it isn't necessarily so blessed and ordained that it was sitting on him. It was the fact of his Hollywoodness. People grew up with him. People knew him. Beretta, you couldn't say Beretta. Everybody has seen that show. Everybody saw him on the Tonight Shows and all that kind of stuff, playing the big guy. Everybody knew who he was. And so now to see him come in and be the shadow of himself, sympathy won the day, and they would not charge him for that. So that is Robert Blake. If you like the channel, subscribe, thumbs up, leave a comment. I love your comments. I'm always trying to answer you guys back. Love you. Have a great day.